Phoebe's kit just got leaked, and I'm sure that many of you are wondering just how our favorite acolyte actually works, because when you look at her abilities, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But luckily, that's what I'm here for. I'm going to explain to you Phoebe's kit, and then talk about her overall power level and teammates, as well as her signature set and weapon. Starting with her basic attacks. Now, first, the basic attacks don't really look that special, and that is because they are not. You just have a free string normal attack, and then a heavy attack which just consumes stamina to deal damage, a plunge attack, and then as always there's just the regular dodge counter. Nothing interesting to be seen here. However, she does have a special aerial heavy attack, which will allow you to glide forward for a certain distance on her cane, and this can be recast after dodging in the air or using the grapple. This seems more like an exploration tool if anything. I don't really understand why they added this, but it's there now, so you gotta deal with it. Her skill has some pretty interesting mechanics to it though. When you press the resonant skill, it will summon a mirror ring at the target location, which will deal spectral damage. When there is a mirror ring close to Phoebe, and Phoebe is outside of the mirror ring, you can tap the skill to teleport her inside of the mirror ring, which will knock back nearby enemies and deal spectro damage. However, if you hold the skill, it will just summon the mirror ring to your location and knock back enemies. Now, this mirror ring is pretty interesting. It lasts for 30 seconds, and when it's generated, it will briefly slow down the movement of any enemies hit by it. This is likely so that enemies don't immediately knock Phoebe out of her own ring. When Phoebe is outside of the ring and her basic attack hits the ring, it will refract Holy Light, which will do spectral damage to enemies, specifically those that are in the mirror ring, however. And it will also pull them closer to the center. This damage is considered basic attack damage. However, if she is in the mirror ring, her basic attacks will be enhanced to a different kind of basic attack, which she can perform up to 3 times, which will do spectral damage. This also counts as basic attack damage. Her Resonance Liberation is just kind of a nuke. Its multiplier is pretty low, but trust me, that will be addressed in her Forte circuit, so don't worry too much about that. Just all you need to know is it's a big nuke. Her intro skill will do spectro damage to enemies and apply 1 stack of Spectro Frazzle. Now, Spectro Frazzle is a mechanic that was recently added to the Spectro Rover, so we actually do have some information about how it works. Her Forte circuit is quite a yap fest, but don't worry about it. I can get through it pretty fast. So Phoebe has 2 Forte bars, Prayer and Gospel. Prayer will generate over time, giving you 5 stacks of Prayer every 1 second. And there's up to 120 stacks, so this will be fully stacked in about 24 seconds. When your Prayer is full and you have no Gospel, you are able to either use a heavy attack or hold her skill to enter one of 2 different modes. If you hold the basic attacks, you will consume all Prayer and directly cast her enhanced heavy attack. This enhanced heavy attack will deal an absurd amount of extra damage to enemies infected with Spectro Frazzle. She will also enter the Absolution state once this is done. She will also generate an additional amount of energy as well as Concerto energy, and it will restore 60 Gospel, which is the other Forte bar. Now, when she is in the Absolution state, she can consume 20 Gospel to use her enhanced heavy attack, and if this hits an enemy affected by Spectro Frazzle, it will deal a ridiculous 160% more damage. This counts as damage amplification, which is the same type of buff you get from Outro skills, so it's an incredibly powerful effect. The damage multiplier of her Resonance Liberation in her Outro skill is also increased by 145%, so this is Phoebe's DPS mode. However, you can't just use her heavy attack willy-nilly, because you have to use her 3rd basic attack or a dodge counter in order to actually cast the heavy attack. Now, as for the second thing you can do with her Prayer, you can hold her skill, which will make it so she consumes all Prayer and enters the Confession state. Choosing to hold the skill will regenerate more resonance and more Concerto energy than if you were to just simply use the heavy attack. So this is clearly meant for a shorter field time Phoebe. Now, during the Confessional state, her enhanced heavy attack will be able to apply 5 stacks of Spectro Frazzle, and her ultimate will be able to apply 8 stacks of Spectro Frazzle. And then when Phoebe casts her Outro skill, she will buff her allies. What she will do is allow them to reduce the spectral resistance of nearby enemies by 10%. Additionally, Spectro Frazzle's damage will be increased by 100%, and its duration will be increased by 50%. So this is meant as a way to support Spectrofrazzle, which is a bit weird because currently we only have Spectrofrazzle in the form of Spectro Rover. But I think that Zani will be our next Spectrofrazzle character, and Phoebe and Zani will be an incredible duo together, but more on that later. Her first inherent skill will make it so that she is able to use her aerial heavy attack one additional time. This is not actually useful for combat, but it's nice for exploration. Her second inherent skill will make it so when she enters one of her two states, she has 12% extra Spectro damage bonus, which is nice. Now currently, due to Zani not existing yet, we are forced into running a main DPS Phoebe. And this would not be such a big problem if it weren't for the fact that her teammate options in the main DPS mode are incredibly limited. Well, I wouldn't call it limited, but she's not able to fully utilize any character's kit. Spectro Rover is essentially a requirement. In her DPS mode, she really relies on Spectrofrazzle being applied to enemies, and Spectrofrazzle doesn't exactly have a long duration, so the singular stack from her intro skill will not be enough. So clearly she needs another source of Spectrofrazzle application, which we need Spectro Rover for. Now for the other team slots, you can use either a Shorekeeper and then use a Moonlit Clouds Rover, or you can decide to run Rover on Rejuvenating Glow, and then use either Sanhua or Mortefi with your Phoebe. But both of these aren't incredible, and I'm gonna tell you why. First of all, Mortefi. A lot of damage Phoebe does count as heavy attack damage, but even with a Mortefi buff, it's less than half, because she splits her damage across so many different damage types. But that wouldn't be that big of an issue, if it weren't for two other reasons. First of all, Phoebe doesn't actually spam heavy attacks, so she's not able to fully utilize Mortefi's damage output. And second of all, she already gives herself 160% damage amplification, so Mortefi's extra 38% is going to be a drop in the bucket. It feels kind of like a waste. And then there's Sanhua. Her basic attack damage buff really does not feel that impactful on Phoebe, because most of her damage is not even basics, so Sanhua's Ultra skill buff does feel a little bit wasted. Now I will say Sanhua's fast rotation and also her buffs do make her good, but again, it just feels like Phoebe doesn't have a good teammate yet. And then for the final option, you can choose to run Shorekeeper with a damaging Spectro Rover, but this comes with its own set of problems. Mainly the fact that Spectro Rover has no way to actually buff Phoebe outside of the Moonlit Cloud set and a little bit of Spectro Resistance Shred. Now while this does sound valuable, think about it in a different context for a second. Think about GN. GN is able to buff his heavy attacks by 38% because of Mortefi, and then Mortefi also has his own personal damage and attack percent buffs through Static Mist, Moonlit Clouds, and his S6. Spectro Rover has none of these, except for Moonlit Clouds, so you really aren't getting that much damage buffing for your Phoebe. So it really does feel like Phoebe's teams are incredibly wasted right now, because she has no real synergy with any one character. This is where Zani is going to come in, and also my big problem with Phoebe's kit design. Characters should always be designed to work on release, but currently, Phoebe's kit feels like it doesn't really function without Zani, and because Zani is coming after Phoebe, it's kind of a disappointment. Am I still going to be pulling? Obviously, I love Phoebe, but it just feels like a weird design, and I don't understand why Kuro is going this direction. But I've yapped plenty now about her teammates, so let's get into her signature weapon. At level 90, it has a base attack of 500, as well as 36% crit rate. This is a pretty good stat spread, although I do feel like a lot of people are going to start overcapping on their Phoebe's crit rate. So I'm not 100% sure if crit rate was the correct decision here. Its passive will increase attack by 12%, and when doing damage to enemies with Spectrofrazzle, the basic and heavy attack damage for Phoebe gets increased by 14%, which can be stacked up to 3 times to a total of 42%. This lasts for 6 seconds. This just enforces her playstyle more of doing big, heavy, and basic damage. Not really much to say about this. However, when casting her Ultra skill, the Spectrofrazzle damage that enemies take will be increased by 50%, which is a pretty decent effect for sub-DPS Phoebe. There is also a new 4-star weapon, having a base attack of 462 and giving 18.2% attack. When attacking an enemy with Spectrofrazzle, you will get 10% extra Spectro damage, which can stack up to 4 times. Feels like a decent weapon, definitely a good F2P alternative to Phoebe's signature, but knowing Wuthering Waves, let's be completely honest here, the SIG is going to be a very big damage increase. And now for Phoebe's sequences. For S1, if she is in her Absolution state, the damage multiplier buff for her Ultra skill and ultimate is going to be increased from 145% to 275%. So you're just going to be seeing bigger nukes here. If you're in the Confession state, the damage multiplier of her ultimate is also increased by 70%, and the amount of stacks of Spectrofrazzle that it will inflict is increased to the maximum amount of stacks possible. It's a good sequence for the DPS mode. I'm not so sure about the sub-DPS mode because she already applies so much Spectrofrazzle, but we'll have to see. For the S2, if you're in the Absolution state, her Ultra skill's damage will be amplified by 150% to targets with Spectrofrazzle. So this just makes her Ultra skill stronger. I don't know why we haven't done anything with her heavies yet, but I guess that's just me. If you're in Confession, the damage dealt by Spectrofrazzle will be amplified by 120%, which is a very strong effect because Spectrofrazzle's damage doesn't actually scale on any of your stats, so the only way to buff it is by buffing it directly. Targets hit by heavy attack Starlight Brilliance, which is the enhanced heavy, will also receive an additional 2 stacks of Spectrofrazzle. This sequence's viability is going to depend on how that Spectrofrazzle application works. If you get the Spectrofrazzle no matter which state you're in, it's very good. However, if it only works in the sub-DPS state, I'm not convinced about this one yet. Her S3 will make it so that the damage multiplier of her heavy attack is increased by 85%. This is actually a really strong sequence, because it gives a different buff than what her Forte gives. Her Forte gives damage amplification, and this increases the multiplier. So you have two different effects here, which means they are not suffering from diminishing returns. So I would say this is actually a really good sequence. Her S4 will make it so whenever one of her basic attack hits the enemy, their spectral damage resistance will be decreased by 10%. As usual with an S4, it's not great. It's just a small damage increase. For S5, whenever you cast her intro skill, Phoebe's spectral damage bonus will be increased by 10% for 15 seconds. Carlotta also had a really disappointing S5 in the beginning, so much like with Carlotta, I expect this to be a placeholder that will be replaced soon enough. And then for the S6, whenever she enters either Confession or Absolution, her crit damage will be increased by 50% for 25 seconds. I think this is a really disappointing S6, because she already is getting so much crit damage due to the sheer amount of crit rate she gives. If you already have like 300 crit damage, what more is 50% going to mean to you? My guess is not so much. So I really hope this S6 gets changed. Overall, I think her sequences aren't that strong right now, but same went for Carlotta, until they changed her sequences entirely near the end of beta, so I'm holding out hope that they're going to change hers as well. I think Phoebe has a really interesting kit, and it's definitely the first of its kind. Kuro Games is really trying to test the limits with what they can do with a character's kit. Carlotta with how her ultimate functions, and now Phoebe with Spectrofrazzle and Brant with his double DPS healer mechanics. So I think it's best to see where they go throughout the beta before we make too many harsh judgments. Kuro Games probably had a really hard time trying to balance Phoebe out with the Spectrofrazzle mechanic and ended up not really making something too stellar, but they still have time to change her. As we saw in the 2.0 beta, Carlotta was incredibly inconsistent and kept changing all the time. So the same might happen to Phoebe, which honestly I really hope it does. But what do you think of Phoebe's kit? Are you going to be pulling for her or not? Let me know in the comments below, and while you're down there, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'm definitely going to be pulling for S6R5 Phoebe because I just like her design that much, and I think she has a lot of potential in the story as well. If you want to discuss with me further, be sure to join my Discord, which is linked in the description. And if you just want to hear my random thoughts on things, be sure to follow me on X or Twitter, whatever you decide to call it, which is also linked in the description. But that'll be it from me. Peace.